Hello, friends, and welcome back to Dare Me to Prosper. My name is Avery, and I'm your host. This is episode 42, and we are discussing the fear of hell. This episode is really going to be, I think, valuable for those of you who have a religious background, a Christian background, and have deconstructed your faith, or maybe you are going through that process. I have been focusing a heavy portion of my TikTok videos around the deconstruction of Christianity because it seems to be something that a lot of people really relate to or have experienced. And I think it's really hitting kind of a collective chord right now. And a lot of people are, at the very least, starting to ask questions that maybe they wouldn't allow themselves to ask before. And a very common topic around religious trauma that really affects a lot of people is this leftover fear of hell. Like even when they have left Christianity, even when they have deconstructed their faith, the fear of hell is something that keeps a lot of people stuck and that tends to stick around too long. And so in this episode, we're really going to dive into that and talk about kind of the mistranslations around hell in the Bible and where this came from and why it's used and how to finally let go of this just subconscious anxiety around hell. Because as you likely know by now, I was a pastor's wife for 13 years. I was, in the belly of the beast with the staff behind the scenes of multiple different churches, multiple different congregations, different sizes from church plants to huge churches. I mean, I have seen it all. And so believe me when I say I have heard and sat through the teachings around hell for a very long time. Now, thankfully, I did not grow up in the church, so this was not something that I really heard a lot about as a child, and so this was not kind of built into my subconscious at an early age, which is where I feel like it really gets people. When people were born in the church and they were raised on this fear of hell, when that gets into your subconscious as a child, I think it's much more powerful, and it's a lot harder to break that down or undo that dogma later on in life. But it's definitely doable, and we're going to do it. Because hell, as you may have been taught, does not exist. And there is no reason to have a fear of something that does not exist. And we're going to get deeper into that because it is really one of those teachings that gets programmed into people's nervous systems from years of conditioning. Very often it is years. And especially for some people, it can really kind of plant itself so deeply into the subconscious that when you consciously question that belief or when you consciously try to reject that belief, your body can still respond with panic or fear or dread, even when you start to deconstruct those beliefs. And this is what people so often don't consider. And they experience this nervous system response and they take that to mean that it must be true. In other words, people feel triggered when they start to question the existence of hell, and they take that feeling of guilt and shame and being triggered as proof of its existence. Does that make sense? Basically, it's so wired into you that your subconscious, your body, is going to try to cling to the belief even when your mind starts to deconstruct. Because it's just your body trying to keep you safe. It does this in all sorts of ways, not just around this topic, but anytime something is deeply wired into your nervous system, it's going to behave in an automatic sense. Because hell is taught in the Christian church as the ultimate punishment, making it one of the strongest fear-based control tactics that they use. And now I say control tactics, I don't think that every pastor is standing up in front of a congregation intentionally trying to mislead people or intentionally trying to control people within the church. But like many things in our systems worldwide, this was a systematic tactic. Not that one person came and said, hey, I have a great idea. Let's convince people that they're going to burn in hell for eternity and use it to control them. I mean, I'm sure at some point that has been thought of, but I think this was more of a mistranslation that then got turned into a control tactic. even unintentionally. And why was it used this way? Because it works. We see this in our governments. We see this in politics, right? Fear makes people easier to control. And on top of that, because it is so often introduced at such a young age, it wires itself into your subconscious mind and into your nervous system. And the body's survival system doesn't know the difference between something that's imagined danger or something that is real danger. It's just listening to what you're feeding it. And so the thought of hell triggers anxiety regardless of it actually existing. It's a perceived fear. So let's talk about why do we even interpret it this way? Why does the Christian church interpret hell in this way? Where did it come from? Where did this mistranslation happen? Thankfully, again, I was not raised in the church. And so these teachings were not truly introduced to me in a very full, complete way until I was in high school and college. So there was no pressure coming from my family. This was very much something that I placed myself in because I was surrounded by people who were in this religion. And so I put myself there as a means to, one, try to connect with God because it was the only script that I knew of how to do that. And two, again, because it was so common around me. I live in the Bible Belt. It felt like everybody was a Christian. However, because I got into it late, this allowed me as a child to not carry that baggage, to not have this fear of hell. And so I grew up, I adopted Christianity, but then as I grew older and I was married to a pastor and I sat through all of these sermons and I learned all of these things, I will say that hell, the idea of hell never really gave me fear. It was not ever something that I really resonated with. And I talk about this in my deconstruction episode, but there was a lot of topics where it was like consciously I adopted them. Like if you asked me, I knew the right answer as a pastor's wife, but inside I didn't carry a deep fear of it because it didn't really resonate with me. It was like, yeah, I know this is the right answer, even though it doesn't quite feel natural to me. But for many people, especially people who tend to carry shame or guilt very easily, like if that is part of your upbringing or you have a lot of trauma around shame and guilt, it's very easy for that fear of hell to take hold because innately you already believe that you are guilty or shameful. And so this idea that you should be eternally punished is easy to convince yourself of or easy for other people to convince you of. But I do not believe hell exists. And I want to get into the translations in a second, but I also just want to say, as I was deconstructing, one of the things that was most interesting to me, again, I talk about this in other episodes, but I really looked into, studied, read books about NDEs, near-death experiences, and reincarnation, past lives. And this was one of the first things that really solidified for me the idea of hell not really existing. Because the more I learned about the studies that have been done on reincarnation and NDEs and what people most often see during near-death experiences and how much overlap there is and how there's actually studies done on near-death experiences, on reincarnation, how children talk about their past lives, and then they are able to go back and prove that this person that this child spoke of really existed and that these things really happened, things that their parents had no idea about, all that sort of stuff. And by the way, I always link my favorite spiritual books and resources in the bottom of the show notes where it says favorite spiritual tools. So go check that out if you want to see some of the books that I recommend. But without getting too heavily into that topic, because that's its own episode, that gave me a lot of confidence in my natural inclination of hell not being real. It validated what I already felt to be true. But then on top of that, it's very simple to read the Bible and understand how these mistranslations came in. The issue is that you've been taught through the church to interpret certain words to immediately mean something that they don't. So for starters, if you just go, I literally Googled Bible verses around hell. So Psalm 16:10, for example, says, this is the NIV version, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. Now, in the Christian church, we have been taught to read realm of the dead as hell or a fiery afterlife. They think that this is saying, or David is saying, God won't let me suffer in hell. The actual translation of this is the Hebrew word Sheol, meaning the grave or place of the dead, literally meaning like your resting place. Translating that to, he's trusting God not to leave him in death forever. It's not about escaping eternal hellfire. It's about just not being dead eternally. There is life after life. And once you see this, once you recognize how often you could read a Bible passage and realize that there is a term or a phrase or a word about the grave or death, you will recognize how your brain instantly, again, if you have religious trauma, especially if you grew up in the church, if you have a heavy church background, your brain wants to translate all of those phrases to mean hell or to mean torture or, that sort of image. But that's not what that is. And this is how that works psychologically, is we've been trained to see one phrase or word and automatically think it means something different. Death or the grave means just that, death or the grave, where your resting place, where your body has been buried. That's a literal translation of those words. It doesn't mean eternal burning. Okay, another example, Ecclesiastes 9:10. This is the NIV version. For in the realm of the dead, where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. So again, a common interpretation of this would be hell is where nothing good exists. So where you're going, there's nothing good there. That hell is this place of evil and burning. But again, if you just translate it verbatim, simply, it's just saying death is rest, right? There's no work, there's no striving, there's no awareness. It's not saying where you are going, you will be tormented. It's saying where you are going, there is just a cease of everything. Everything stops. You're not working anymore. You're not planning anymore. You don't have knowledge or wisdom anymore. You're just dead. And again, like we were saying in the last verse, death is not forever. There is life after life. But in the moment of death, everything ceases. Do you see how funny it is how automatically these scriptures get translated into meaning things like torture and hell and eternal fire when literally that meaning is not there? And listen, before I get too much further, I'm not going to convince you of something you don't want to be convinced of. There's Bible scholars or people who have studied the Bible who have different opinions. For me, I came to the belief that hell was not real before I ever went looking for the validation. I didn't even need to understand that this was a complete mistranslation for me to fully believe and deconstruct this idea of hell. That's how much, one, I didn't resonate with it. And two, again, once I started reading into past lives and reincarnation and NDEs, that to me made so much more sense. Not only does it make more sense, but we have modern proof. We have modern evidence of these things. And mind you, we have zero modern evidence around hell. Okay, but let's keep going because this is fun, right? Matthew 16:18, NIV version, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Okay, so Hades is a Greek word that, surprise, surprise, literally just means the grave or realm of the dead. Again, the literal translation just being the dwelling place of the deceased, where you are once you die, a place that is distinct from the physical world. And I was just curious, so I went digging even deeper into this because a lot of people think of Greek mythology, like Hades, meaning the god of the underworld and the underworld itself. And again, we have been taught to directly translate this to like hell or Satan or like this ruler of this horrible place and this horrible place itself. But if you go back and study or look at the original meaning of this Greek word, it wasn't defined as a place of punishment. Again, it was just defined as a place where all souls went when they died. They were just assuming that once you died, your soul went somewhere else. So they believed that there was life after death, but their general phrase for that place was just realm of the dead or the grave. And in Greek mythology, they had a god who ruled over this realm of the dead, not because it was an evil, bad, destructive place, just because it was a place separate from the physical earth where they believed all of these souls were going. Okay, so then later, the Hebrew Bible gets translated into Greek. And so we talked about the Hebrew word Sheol, the grave, the realm of the dead. And so translators would use this word Hades to stand in for the Hebrew word Sheol. That is such an awkward word to say. I don't know if I'm phrasing that right. Anyways, so what happened is this became like the cultural bridge word. It wasn't meant to import Greek mythology into it. It was just a translation from one language into another. And again, this is how the Bible gets so mistranslated in the first place. It's going from language to language to language, years over years over years. And this is just one tiny example of how these things get so mistranslated. And in the Christian church, what's really taught is kind of this blanket statement of, well, it was written by God through men, right? Which, by the way, would be a literal example of channeling, like channeling another being, which Christians demonize. But moving on, they say that, it was written by God through men. So there can't be any error. There can't be any mistranslation, which is just ridiculous. As if the Bible didn't get translated and changed over time simply because God wouldn't allow it? Which is funny because God allows all of these other things. I've never heard good logical reasoning for why Christians think that the Bible could not be changed over time, misinterpreted, things removed, things added, etc., etc. Okay, so to go back to the translation, over time, in the Greek and Roman culture, and again, you can just look this up, the lines got blurred around this definition. And again, this is where I really believe the control tactics started to come in. I mean, control tactics have been around forever, but in this particular context, this era is when they took Hades from Greek myth and kind of fused it later with these ideas of punishment and eternal torture and fire, and basically scaring people with the fear of the unknown, right? Because if you're going to try to control a collective, what a great way to do it in a way, especially back then, a way that they had no way of proving, right? Nobody could prove what happened after you died. So if these quote unquote leaders come to you with this quote unquote knowledge from God, and they are teaching and they are telling you that this is what it means, that after you die, if you don't accept Jesus, if you don't accept these teachings that we are giving you, you will burn in hell forever. And nobody could prove it wrong. And so yes, over time, this got adopted as the new translation behind Hades or Sheol. And so then when the translation happened and the Greek mythology word Hades became the crossover word for Sheol, the Greeks already associated Hades with a shadowy underworld. Like this was already established in their minds. And over time, Christians layered the mythological ideas into the Bible theology. So this, again, is an example of how it wasn't like an overnight thing. These things changed slowly over time, over generations. Throughout leadership. It wasn't necessarily that one guy said, hey, let's use this as a control tactic. It was more like it slowly kind of got overlapped and mistranslated. But then once the information was there, once the misinterpretation was available, it was very easy to really lean into that as a use of control. And then I didn't even mention the term Gehenna, which is often translated also in modern Bible translations as hell. But this is an Aramaic word that meant a valley outside of Jerusalem where garbage and bodies were burned. But again, instantly, especially if you grew up in the church or if you have a lot of church background, you might know that. You might know that translation and your mind associates it to hell. Why? Because fire. You hear they burned bodies or they burned garbage, and instantly your mind translates that to hell. Why? Because you were conditioned to think of fire as torture and hell. In reality, this translation, it was just a symbol of destruction. The tower crumbling, right? It was a symbol of death or destruction, not eternal torture. That's like saying that our landfills are translated to hell. But you don't hear the word landfill and think hell. You also wouldn't see somebody burning trash and think hell and think that those were the same things, because they're not. This is a mistranslation. What started as imagery for death or destruction turned into quote unquote eternal fire later down the road. And once Christianity became institutionalized and once leaders discovered that fear was such a powerful motivator for obedience, you better believe that they leaned hard into that teaching. So even if it didn't necessarily originate as a control tactic, it was like once the ingredients were there, they were off to the races. Because teaching that disobedience or doubt led to eternal torment made people so much easier to control, and it kept them dependent on the church for safety. Because again, these times, the church and the government were the same thing, right? Disobedience of the Bible was like breaking a law. And so hell became the number one threat. Fear of eternal punishment was overriding people's logic, and still does, because it deeply embeds itself into your subconscious, and therefore it affects your behavior. Which brings us to where we are now, where people who have sat under religious or Christian teachings still have a very real fear of hell, even after deconstructing. Because tying hell to eternal death or punishment basically hijacked the most human instinct you have to survive. The fear of death is primal in everyone, right? Your body is wired to survive. And so if they can program your subconscious with this fear of not only death, but like forever eternal punishment in death, they can successfully influence your actions with control. But even after you have deconstructed, even after you no longer believe in hell, even after you shift your beliefs, your nervous system can still react as though the threat is real. Because these are two different systems that work in tandem, right? You've got your mind and your conscious thoughts, and then you've got your subconscious and your nervous system. And so this is why even when you start to deconstruct this belief around hell, you might still feel like panic or guilt. Like, but what if I'm wrong? That is exactly what that teaching is meant to do. Because again, especially back then, people had no way of proving it. So it felt safer to believe this teaching than to risk being wrong. And that is still the case for many people. However, personally, I now believe we have enough evidence to point to the non-existence of hell, but also this is just a very unnatural belief. If you were not raised in the church, especially like if you grew up like I did as a child who was not taught about hell, that was a very unnatural teaching when I finally did learn it in high school and college. That's why it never resonated with me. I heard that and thought, that really doesn't make sense. Why would this God, who is so loving, literally create a system where you have to follow his own rules, and if you don't, he created a place for you to go and be tortured forever? Oh, but he'll save you from those rules by killing his quote-unquote son. You see what I'm saying? It's a whole made-up system that if the system didn't exist, there wouldn't be a need for hell in the first place. The way that the Bible teaches this whole idea of sin and Adam and Eve and the garden, it's like if God is all powerful and all creative, why did the garden exist in the first place? Why does sin work like this in the first place? If he created everything and he created the system, then he could change it. Anyway, rabbit hole. I'm getting off topic. But I think a lot of this just goes back to the fact that we just don't question things. It's just uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. And honestly, it just takes a lot of brain power to critically think through a lot of these topics. And quite honestly, a lot of us are just tired and we're exhausted and we're just trying to survive. We're just trying to pay our bills and keep our families safe and fed. Not only is it a lot of work, but it's also really scary to deconstruct these ideas when you have been taught this for so long. It's very uncomfortable, and a lot of people don't like to feel uncomfortable. So how does this show up in your nervous system even after you've deconstructed, right? It still comes up through a nervous system response. It's a survival response. It's a survival instinct where maybe you're deconstructing or you're thinking or exploring new beliefs, but your body, your subconscious goes, but what if? But what if I'm wrong? Or you feel guilty, or you feel shameful. You feel anxiety when you start to step outside of the rules that you have been taught. That is what the teaching was meant to do. That is showing you that that teaching is working. That's why they use it. That's why they used it back then. That's why they use it today. Fear keeps people easily controlled. They do this with all sorts of things. They scare you with fines. They scare you with health crises. They scare you with threats to your children. They scare you economically and financially. All of these things are ways that are used today to keep people in fear and easy to control. The teaching of hell is no different. So the million-dollar question is, if this is you, if you have this lagging fear of hell that you still struggle with, even if it's subtle, even if it's just anxiety or a little bit of guilt or a little bit of shame, how do you move past that? How do you process that? How do you let that go so that it no longer has any kind of hold on you? It's the same way you would handle any other trauma or fear. Quick disclaimer, I am not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. If you are dealing with severe trauma, I'm not a mental health professional. This is simply my experience and the healthiest way I believe to deal with trauma and fear and anxiety, etc. But again, like other traumas, like fear, the first thing you have to do is recognize it. You have to see that it's there in order to process it. So you have to be aware that you still have this lingering belief. You have to be aware that this still sits in your subconscious. So just noticing it, that's step one. Processing it. So trying to understand it. Where did it come from? Why does it sit in you this way, right? It's the same reason that you go to therapy and do talk therapy or do various forms of therapy around certain topics. You are recognizing the issue and you are understanding the issue. That is processing the issue. But the most important thing, I believe, to understand around healing this old wound is remembering that you can change your mind very quickly, right? You can deconstruct in a day, in a week, and decide, you know what, I no longer believe this. You can make up your mind very quickly, but reprogramming your nervous system doesn't happen with the same speed. You can change your mind in a day. Reprogramming your nervous system takes months or sometimes years. And this is where the problem comes in, because maybe you have deconstructed mentally, consciously, I no longer believe in hell. This is not something that I resonate with. This is not something I believe anymore. But your body, your nervous system, has a program that it's been running for a long time, and it's going to respond to that program no matter what you did to change your mind until it gets used to the idea that this new belief is here to stay. And so it's more than just changing your mind. If you're somebody that has this underlying trauma, it's also teaching your nervous system the new belief and teaching it the new way to respond, which means you have to constantly remind your nervous system of what your truth is. And if hell was built on mistranslation and fear, how do you start reconnecting with truth? This is where we start talking about going inside of yourself, learning to trust you again instead of outsourcing your beliefs to someone else. I talk about this in depth. I go through it baby step, baby step, baby step in my course Sensitive to Psychic, which is all about embodying who you really are, embodying your psychic gifts. But the foundation of that is just this: learning how to trust yourself, learning how to trust your own intuition and guidance, learning how to distinguish that from fear and anxiety. You do not jump straight from one way of being to an entirely different way of being overnight or in a week. This is a transformation from the inside out, and you have to build that foundation of trusting yourself and understanding yourself before your nervous system will start to believe you. And so if you really want somebody to walk you through that process, that course is linked in the description, and it is truly a really detailed breakdown of the process. Like, here is exactly what you do, and here is what you should practice. Because as someone who took years to do this work, I understand what it's like to hear these concepts and then feel like, but what do I do? How do I actually go about living that? How do I actually get from point A to point B? How do I go from being a sensitive person to being a psychic? And when I say psychic, I don't mean like you have to do psychic readings for people. I just mean truly your intuition, from tapping into your intuition. That's what being psychic is. It's reading your intuition really well. And that's what Sensitive to Psychic teaches, is learning how to tune your body to communicate with spirit, to communicate with the universe, so that you can open up your natural channel to the universe and build your confidence in your own direct knowledge, your own direct discernment. Again, instead of outsourcing your beliefs to an outdated system. But it all goes back to establishing safety for your nervous system, establishing safety in your body, because you can't just tell your physical vessel. You can't just tell your body that you believe something different. Your body's going to make you prove it. You have to prove that this new belief is real. And so your nervous system needs repetition. It needs safety. It needs constant reminders that it's safe, that this idea of hell is not a threat. It's like you rescued a dog off the side of the road who's been beaten and tortured and starved. It's not going to trust you on day one. You have to day after day after day after day prove that you are a safe place. Remind them over and over and over again with your actions that you are safe, that you are a safe place for them. That is what you need to do to your nervous system. So just understand that it's going to take time. So if you're one of these people who has deconstructed your faith, but you still have this lingering fear of hell, just know that it's not going to happen overnight. It's programmed into your nervous system. It's programmed into your subconscious. And now you have to do the work of unraveling that. And it's okay that it takes time. You're not alone. You're not the only one experiencing this, but you're also not destined to deal with this lagging trauma forever. You can heal it. You can release it and never have to feel like hell is something that you need to worry about, because it does not exist. And the way that your body responds to it in fear is exactly what it was intended to do. So this episode is getting a little long, but I hope that you enjoyed it. If you are somebody that has deconstructed your Christian faith, if you are no longer practicing religion and you found this episode helpful at all, I would love to hear from you. Don't forget to leave a review for the podcast, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. Please leave a review. It helps a ton. You can always email me as well at daremetoprosper@gmail.com if you have any questions or topic requests. All of the links are in the description as always. And thank you guys for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.